The Valiant shouldn't be here, not after 20 years, not after its disappearance had been filed under irrecoverable loss in every aerospace archive on Earth. It should have remained a cautionary tale, a footnote in mankind's failed attempts at long-range exploration. But it was here, hanging in orbit over the Pacific Recovery Zone, its hull as intact as the day it left Earth. And that was the problem. I stood inside Observation Chamber 4, staring at live telemetry from the ship's outer hull. The external plating bore no signs of degradation, no micrometeoroid scarring, no prolonged radiation wear, no thermal erosion from re-entry or sudden acceleration. 20 years should have left marks, even in the vacuum. But Valiant had returned in pristine condition, as if it had been plucked from the moment of its disappearance and set back into the present. I checked the timestamps again. Launched in 2057. Declared lost in 2059. Returned in 2079. I tapped my fingers against the console, watching the silent hull through the external cameras. Someone had joked, too loudly in the briefing, that it was like seeing a dead man walk through the front door, dressed in the same suit he was buried in. The silence that followed had been thick and knowing. No one laughed at the absurdity, because the absurdity wasn't funny. My name is Nathaniel Kessler, forensic astrophysicist for the Aerospace Anomaly Response Division. AARD doesn't handle conventional disasters. There are other teams for that. We handle the unaccountable returns, the telemetry paradoxes, the black box data that contradicts reality. When something comes back that shouldn't, we find out why. Which is why I was here, standing inside quarantine control, 400 kilometers above Earth, waiting to meet the men who were supposed to be long dead. The Valiant's crew had been scheduled for re-entry, but the world had no interest in welcoming them home just yet. Instead, they were being ferried via a controlled docking sequence, sealed inside a reinforced medical decon chamber, where they'd be subjected to biometric analysis, cognitive testing, and prolonged quarantine observation. The official reason was decontamination protocol. The real reason was uncertainty. Because the first thing the flight surgeon noted when they arrived was that their biometric signatures weren't perfect matches. They were close enough that a casual scan might not flag the discrepancy. Close enough that, in any other case, someone might have assumed equipment error and moved on. But this wasn't any other case. The Valiant had been lost for 20 years, and now its crew had returned insisting that only 32 days had passed for them. There was a knock against the observation chamber glass. Dr. Edward Langley stood on the other side, arms folded. His face was lined with the exhaustion of too many shifts without sleep. Langley was lead specialist in quantum displacement studies, a field that had gained far too much interest since the ship's return. He jerked his head towards the chamber entrance. "They're ready for preliminary interview," he said. I exhaled slowly, centering my thoughts. Then I stepped into the decon corridor. I had seen photos of the Valiant crew before they launched. High-resolution mission stills, pre-flight psych evaluations, training footage. I had studied them, memorized their faces, their ages at launch, their habitual mannerisms. The men sitting before me were those men, but not exactly. Their posture was too rigid. Their uniforms, pulled from the ship's supply lockers, were pristine, unworn, as if they'd never seen actual use. Their expressions held something unreadable, not blank, but composed in a way that seemed practiced. Captain Warren Monroe was the first to speak. "Good to see Earth again, gentlemen." Langley and I exchanged a glance. I took the lead. "Captain Monroe, I'm Nathaniel Kessler, assigned to lead forensic analysis on the Valiant's return. Do you understand why you and your crew are under extended quarantine?" Monroe nodded. "You're verifying mission discrepancies, ensuring no biological contamination, no cognitive degradation due to prolonged deep space exposure. We expected as much." I tapped the edge of my tablet, choosing my words carefully. "You filed a distress signal before your disappearance. Final telemetry showed a sudden propulsion failure followed by complete loss of communications. Then nothing. We searched for 6 years before terminating recovery efforts. Now you're here, 20 years later. Do you understand how that looks? Monroe's expression didn't shift. It looks impossible? His voice was measured, confident. He believed what he was saying. Then tell me, I said. What do you remember? He glanced at his men. Then, as if on cue, they all nodded in unison. The moment stretched a fraction too long, just enough for the back of my neck to prickle. Monroe exhaled. 32 days, Kessler. That's how long it's been for us. We conducted standard deep space navigational tests, encountered a subspace anomaly during a routine trajectory adjustment, and then... He hesitated for exactly 1 second. Then we were here. No change in vocal intonation, no attempt to explain the gaps in logic, just a statement of fact presented with absolute certainty. I switched tactics. What's the last thing you remember before arrival? Reviewing the ship's systems, all functional. No recorded malfunctions, no indication that anything was wrong. Then why did your distress signal indicate a total propulsion failure? Monroe's expression didn't flicker. That must be an error. I looked at Langley. His jaw was tight. He'd already reviewed the logs. There was no error. Before I could press further, a quiet chime sounded. A biometric alert from the central medical feed. Langley stiffened. Hold on. Your medical scans just updated. The screen beside us displayed real-time physiological data, and Monroe's readout was fluctuating. Langley leaned forward. Your blood chemistry just shifted mid-test. Monroe blinked at him. His men sat perfectly still. That's impossible, he said. Langley sat stiffly, eyes flicking between the biometric readings and the Valiant crew. I knew that look. It was the same one I had when I found something that shouldn't exist, but had to accept that it did. The biometric feed displayed Captain Monroe's vitals, but they weren't behaving the way they should. His blood oxygen levels cycled through a precise, rhythmic variation, as if following an unseen algorithm rather than biological randomness. His heart rate held steady for exactly 43 seconds before adjusting by 2 beats per minute, then reversing the change at the same interval. Even his body temperature fluctuated by a precise 1/10 of a degree every 90 seconds, a level of consistency that had no biological explanation. It wasn't an anomaly of failure, it was an anomaly of intent. Monroe met Langley's eyes without expression. There must be a system malfunction, he said, as if stating an obvious fact. Langley tapped at the data screen with the back of his knuckle. This isn't a mechanical error. You've been scanned twice. The readout is changing in real time. Monroe didn't move. I feel fine. I studied him. There was no sign of distress, no sweat, no rapid breathing, nothing suggesting he was aware of any biological inconsistency. But my mind latched onto something more troubling, the absence of reaction itself. A normal person, hell, a normal astronaut, would at least show concern that their body wasn't registering consistently. But Monroe was calm. Too calm. Langley exhaled sharply, rubbing at his temple before pulling up the archived pre-mission biometric records. Your resting BPM at launch was 63. It's 60 now. Minor variance, sure, but your blood composition is marginally off too. Plasma protein levels decreased by 5.2%. There is no physiological condition known to medical science that would naturally induce those changes over a 4-week period. Monroe remained still, and yet here I am. I pushed the chair back slightly and folded my hands, keeping my voice neutral. You understand how this looks, Captain. Your ship vanished for 20 years. You and your crew claim only 32 days have passed. Your biometric signatures don't quite match what they were at launch, and now you're showing fluctuations that are scientifically impossible. That's a lot to take in. Monroe gave a slow nod. It is. I'd be skeptical too. But he wasn't skeptical. He was accepting, like a man who knew exactly what he was, even if we didn't. Langley's patience snapped first. You're acting like this is normal, he said. Like we're the ones missing something obvious. Monroe turned his head slightly. "You're assuming something is wrong with us," he said, his tone even. "Has it occurred to you that something might be wrong with your data?" I held his gaze. "That's exactly what we're trying to determine." The silence that followed was like a script with missing lines. And then Monroe did something that sent a cold flicker through me. He smiled. Not a full smile, just a fractional upward shift at the corner of his mouth, a micro-expression, something added for effect rather than instinct. I pushed my chair back fully. "We need further analysis before we clear you for reintegration." Monroe's half-smile didn't change. "Of course." None of them protested, not one of them, and that's when I knew. They were cooperating too much. 2 hours later, I was inside Quarantine Research Bay 3, reviewing Valiant's structural telemetry scans. The ship had been moved into a containment docking platform outside the station, where it would remain sealed off until we determined the nature of its 20-year absence. Langley was leaning against the workstation beside me, arms crossed, drinking coffee that had long since gone cold. His attention was locked on the materials analysis report, his face a collage of frustration and disbelief. "This can't be right," he muttered. "Which part?" "All of it." He flicked his hand toward the report on my screen. "Hull composition is off by less than 1%, but it's off. Alloy density is fractionally heavier than when it was launched. Bulkhead measurements are misaligned by margins too small for human error. Hell, even the internal materials have atomic inconsistencies. The ship is the same, but it isn't." I stared at the readout. "You think it was reconstructed?" Langley's jaw tightened. "I think it was copied, almost perfectly." I closed my eyes for a moment. The mass discrepancy was small, barely enough to be noticed under conventional analysis. But mass doesn't just increase without an external variable. The ship had come back heavier than when it left, and now we had biological and structural deviations. Something had changed. Not just the crew, the ship itself. I straightened and tapped into the next file. Interior mapping scans. At a glance, the Valiant's layout was exactly as recorded. Crew compartments, bridge, medbay, engineering. The AI had flagged no deviations in basic structure, but there was one flagged inconsistency. "Langley." I turned the monitor toward him. "There's a sealed section in the cargo bay. It wasn't in the original mission plans." He leaned in, frowning. "How sealed?" "Airlocked. Command overrides don't respond. The ship's security protocols locked it from the inside, but the crew insists it was always like that." Langley's fingers drummed against the metal counter. "That's not standard procedure." I glanced at the mass discrepancy again. "No, it isn't." I stood in Valiant's airlock chamber half an hour later, encased in a containment suit. The external diagnostics registered no airborne contaminants, no chemical irregularities, no unexpected radiation sources. But the ship still felt wrong. Not in any way the sensors could quantify. The atmospheric pressure registered normal, but sound carried strangely through the suit's external pickups, muted in some places, oddly amplified in others. The air was still, yet the moment I stepped inside, there was a sensation, not one I could name, because it wasn't something I was feeling. It was something I wasn't feeling, like stepping into a room that should be full of familiar environmental noise but registers as sterile silence instead. Like being in a space that had been meticulously erased rather than merely cleaned. Langley stood beside me, his face partially obscured behind his visor. "You're sure we don't need a full decontamination cycle?" "Scans showed no pathogens. If something's in here, it isn't biological." He didn't look comforted. The sealed cargo bay was at the far end of the ship, beyond the main supply holds. As we moved through the corridors, I noticed that the bulkheads were subtly mismatched. Not enough to be noticed at a glance, but once I'd seen it in the scans, I couldn't unsee it. The ship's structure had been altered at an atomic level. Langley reached the control panel first and ran an override command. The security locks responded a fraction of a second slower than they should have. as if something was processing the request before allowing it. Then the bay doors slid open, and inside, in perfect symmetrical rows, were hundreds of cocoon-like structures. Some were smooth. Others looked partially fractured, revealing something underneath that I couldn't quite comprehend at a glance. Langley swallowed. Jesus! I turned toward Langley, and as I did, the cocoon closest to us shifted slightly. Not moving, not growing, but adjusting its structure, as if it had just recognized us. Langley took a half step back, his breath audible in my earpiece. The containment suit's external air pressure sensors registered no movement in the room beyond our own, no external shifts. But I had seen it. The cocoon had adjusted itself, not growing, not unfurling, but reacting. I forced my mind to compartmentalize, to dissect the situation into manageable parts. There were hundreds of them, rigid, fibrous, organic but precise in their arrangement, row upon row, evenly spaced, as if their placement followed some strict geometric requirement. The bay itself had no signs of habitation, no storage crates, no leftover rations, nothing suggesting these structures had been stored here. I exhaled sharply and took a slow step forward, my boot contacting the deck with a near imperceptible delay. A fraction of a second too long before the vibrations carried through the ship. My suit stabilizers adjusted for it, but the sensation remained. Something was affecting the ship's physical response to movement. Langley's voice fizzed in my earpiece. Are we supposed to pretend we didn't see that? No. I adjusted my visor's scanner overlay, running an immediate molecular analysis on the nearest structure. But we're also not going to jump to conclusions before we have data. His breath steadied, his training kicking in over his nerves. Composition. Organic, protein-based, fibrous. Some biopolymer integration, not quite keratin, not quite chitin. No known analogues in human physiology. Langley crouched beside another cocoon, his containment gloves hovering just above its surface. Surface readings show no microbial presence, no external degradation. They should have biological byproducts. Even synthetic polymer structures develop trace environmental alterations after prolonged exposure to an active biosphere. But these are pristine. I flexed my jaw. Like the ship. Langley didn't respond immediately. I could hear the tension in his breath. We need to take a sample. He was right. But the moment I considered it, something in my mind hesitated, like a survival instinct engaging at the last second before stepping somewhere I shouldn't. I ignored it. I wasn't about to let some atavistic paranoia keep me from getting the answers we needed. I set my equipment case on the deck, disengaged the sterilized containment field, and removed a precision biopsy tool, an instrument designed for non-invasive sample extraction. We had protocols for handling unknown biological matter. The tool activated with a low vibration, its molecular blade calibrated for micron-thin tissue extraction. I adjusted the settings, set the extraction field to minimum incursion, and placed the instrument against the outer membrane of the cocoon. The moment it made contact, the ship responded. Not the cocoon, the ship itself. The deck beneath my boots shifted. Not physically, but in a way my body struggled to process, like I had stepped somewhere else entirely for a fraction of a second and then returned. My suit's telemetry flashed, all readings spiking out of expected variance for exactly 1.2 seconds. Langley swore, stumbling back, his suit stabilizers compensating too slowly. What the hell was that? I exhaled carefully, watching the cocoon. It hadn't changed. No movement, no outward reaction. But I knew better than to believe it wasn't aware of the interaction. The biopsy tool's data stream updated, and I read the results. Langley caught my hesitation. What? I didn't look at him immediately. The molecular sequencing. I stopped, recalibrated, ran the scan again. This isn't one structure. Langley's brow furrowed. Come again. I turned the monitor toward him. This isn't an individual entity. The molecular sequencing is registering adaptive redundancy across multiple points, as if every cocoon in this room is part of a singular interconnected system. Langley's face hardened. They're not separate organisms. No. My throat felt dry. There won. Silence stretched between us, the kind of silence that wasn't just about the absence of sound, but about the presence of something else. I forced myself to process. If these weren't individual entities, that meant their collective function was integrated, meaning whatever they were, whatever they contained, whatever they were becoming, it was operating under a unified directive. Langley turned toward the exit, tension in every line of his posture. "We need to report this." But I was still staring at the biopsy data, because there was one more thing. A single partial match in the molecular database. Not exact, not even close enough to identify as a species correlation, but close enough that the system had flagged it under historical records. Not human, not terrestrial, not extraterrestrial either. The match had come from a prior anomaly investigation decades ago. A fragmentary reading from a deep space probe that had encountered something at the edge of the heliosphere, an event that had been classified and buried after its entire data system had been corrupted upon transmission. The Valiant had never left the solar system. But somehow its hull, its crew, and its cargo now carried a genetic imprint of something that should have been light years beyond our reach. Langley's voice pulled me back. "Kessler, let's go." Langley grabbed my arm, his suit servos humming softly as he pulled me toward the exit. I didn't resist. The airlock cycled shut behind us, the decompression sequence sealing the cargo bay behind heavy reinforced bulkheads. Neither of us spoke as we moved through Valiant's central corridor, past the rows of untouched crew compartments and the softly humming terminals displaying meaningless normality. We needed answers, and I wasn't convinced we were going to like them. The crew sat in debriefing isolation, behind reinforced observation glass. Monroe and his officers had been split into separate rooms for one-on-one questioning, to break up the psychological reinforcement loop that could occur if they had rehearsed responses. Langley took the adjacent room, prepping for biological resampling. I took the interrogation chamber, standing in front of Lieutenant Kalen, the Valiant's navigation officer. He looked normal, which was a problem. 20 years of absence, 32 days of perceived time, impossible biological readings. He shouldn't have looked normal. There should have been some physiological indicator of trauma, some subconscious crack in his mask, some sign that he understood the magnitude of what had happened. But he just sat there, hands folded neatly in front of him, waiting. I didn't sit. I let the silence stretch between us. Silence makes people fill space. If there's an inconsistency in their story, they'll try to control the moment, steer it in a way that feels safe. Kalen didn't. I checked the observation feed. His biometric readings were steady. No increased heart rate. No micro-expressions of anxiety. Just waiting. I tapped my console, bringing up a series of recorded pre-mission interviews with the Valiant's crew. I let one play, a short exchange from a psychological readiness assessment before launch. Kalen's own voice filled the chamber, his voice before. I think deep space missions have always carried a certain risk of existential dissonance. We're not just exploring, we're stepping into places that never expected us to be there. We can't assume the universe was made for us to understand. The recording ended. I looked at him. "Do you still believe that?" Kalen blinked, just once, then nodded. "Yes." "Did you encounter something out there?" Kalen smiled. Not a polite smile, not a nervous one. Just the exact curvature required to suggest the appearance of reassurance, nothing more. "We found exactly what we were meant to find." I let the silence stretch between us, waiting to see if he would fill it. He didn't. I exhaled slowly, keeping my tone measured. "Tell me about the cocoons." Kalen blinked once. "They've always been there." His voice didn't change, didn't waver, but there was something hollow in the way he said it. Like he wasn't reciting a memory, just a line of code running through its assigned function. "They weren't there at launch." His expression didn't flicker. "Then the records must be incorrect." I stared at him. You know that's not true. I know they've always been there. I switched tactics, pulled up another file, a simple image. A photo of his family taken before launch, his wife, his son, their home in Houston. I turned the tablet toward him. What's your son's name? A normal person would answer without hesitation, wouldn't need to think, wouldn't need to retrieve the information. It would just be there. Kalen's lips parted slightly, his head tilted just a fraction, an imperceptible delay. Then something flashed across his face, something like confusion, like searching. Then it was gone. Thomas, he said evenly. His son's name was Michael. My fingers tightened around the tablet. It wasn't just the wrong name, it was spoken perfectly, like it had always been true. I tapped the next file, a group photo, the Valiant crew before launch. Who's that? Kalen barely glanced at the image. Captain Monroe! I held his gaze. Look again. He did. His pupils contracted slightly, and for the briefest moment, I saw it again. That infinitesimal pause, that fraction of a second where reality and recognition didn't quite align. Then he looked back at me. That's Captain Monroe. No doubt, no correction. It wasn't Monroe. It was an engineer who never made it onto the final mission roster. Langley's voice buzzed through my earpiece, sharp with urgency. Kessler, get in here. I turned without another word, leaving Kalen sitting there, and made my way to the medical lab. Langley was hunched over the DNA sequencing terminal, his hands pressed against the console. The screen displayed side-by-side comparisons of the crew's pre-launch genetic profiles and the results from our recent scans. The readings were almost identical. Almost. This shouldn't be possible, Langley muttered, but it's happening. He pointed at Monroe's scan. Watch. The real-time feed fluctuated, not wildly, not in a way that should have mattered, but it was shifting, actively, not degrading, not failing, rewriting itself. They're not just close, Langley whispered. They're still adjusting. I stared at the readings, feeling something cold and heavy settle in my stomach. It was a correction. They were still becoming. The emergency alert blared before either of us could speak. Medical containment breach, subject Kalen, biosignal instability detected. By the time I reached the debriefing chamber, the walls were streaked with something black. Not blood, not organic matter, but something that looked like a smear in reality itself, as if the light around it wasn't bending properly. Kalen was convulsing on the floor, his breath stuttering, his body twitching in patterns that weren't random. His voice was making sound, but it wasn't speech. It wasn't even human phonetics. His mouth was still moving, but his voice was coming from somewhere else. He collapsed completely, still and unmoving. His biometric readings were gone, not flatlined, gone, like they'd never been there at all. Langley's hands trembled as he held the scanner over what should have been biological tissue, but there was nothing left to read. The form on the floor looked human, but the second you tried to think about it too hard, it wasn't. The shape was still there, limbs, torso, the suggestion of features, but every biological marker was absent. His mass hadn't disappeared. It had just unbecome. Like something had let go of the illusion of structure, and whatever remained was just an approximation of matter hovering at the edge of real physics. Langley made a strangled sound and backed up. This isn't decomposition, this isn't anything. His voice cracked. He turned the scanner toward me, pointing at the data feed. No blood, no cellular collapse, no trace of human organic matter at all. It was true. The scanner read 0% biological consistency, not even residual proteins. It was as if Kalen had never existed. I forced myself to swallow. That's not possible. Langley's fingers dug into the console, his knuckles bone white. Then explain it, Kessler. Explain where the hell he went. Before I could answer, the station's alarm systems blared. Quarantine breach. Containment chamber 3. Unstable vital readings detected. I was already moving before the second alert flashed. Langley was a step behind. and neither of us spoke as we sprinted through the station's corridors, our boots hammering against the metal flooring. The quarantine chamber loomed ahead. The security panel flashed erratically, struggling to maintain a stable biometric readout. The numbers weren't just wrong, they weren't human. I stopped short of the entrance, my instincts overriding my impulse to override the door. Langley halted beside me, his breath quick, erratic. Neither of us moved forward. Instead, I turned to the observation window. Inside, the remaining Valiant crew stood motionless, perfectly aligned in the center of the chamber. Monroe was at the front. His officers flanked him in an eerie symmetry, their hands resting at their sides, their expressions placid. "They're not blinking," Langley whispered. He was right. Their eyes remained open, too still, too unseeing. It wasn't catatonia. There was no vacant dissociation, no trembling hesitation in their posture. "What the hell are they waiting for?" Langley shook his head, unable to answer. Then Monroe moved. Not all at once. Not like a man deciding to shift his weight or adjust his stance. It was gradual, starting at the base of his neck, rippling outward like a slow fracture in frozen glass. The seam split first, running vertically from his clavicles down his sternum, opening in a long, deliberate tear. The others followed. One by one, their skin peeled away, layer by layer, their human shape coming apart in ribbons of wet, translucent tissue. There was no blood, no muscle, no exposed organs beneath. Just emptiness. The bodies inside were incomplete, unfinished things, stretched in places, warped as if the transformation hadn't fully resolved. Their rib cages were cavernous, protecting nothing, their empty interiors lined with fine, restless filaments that flexed and contracted, as if searching for something that should have been there but wasn't. Their skulls carried just enough of their former proportions to suggest their original human forms, but the details were off. Their eyes set too wide, their jaws just a little too long, the skin rippling along their foreheads like something still settling into place. When they opened their mouths, I expected screaming, but there was no sound. No vocal cords, no breath, just a gaping hollow that led nowhere. A tunnel without an end. And yet, they spoke. Not from their bodies, not from any one source. The words came from the walls, from the station itself, vibrating through the steel and circuitry, resonating in my bones, in my teeth, inside my head. "If you found them, then they've always been there." Langley stumbled backward, hitting the opposite wall, his face pale beneath the emergency lighting. I could hear his breathing, ragged, broken. I gripped the edge of the console, forcing myself to stay anchored to reality. The realization came in pieces, fracturing my understanding like glass under pressure. The cocoons. They were birth sacs. The real crew, the men who launched 20 years ago, were gone. They had never come home. This thing before us was what had returned in their place. It had worn their memories, shaped itself into the echo of their forms, attempted to reconstruct what had been lost. But it hadn't gotten it right. And now it knew. I fought the instinct to back away. The observation window was the only barrier between us and them, and I didn't trust the way the chamber walls looked thinner than they had moments ago. I forced myself to speak. "You aren't them." Monroe turned his head slightly, the movement delayed, catching up to his intent a fraction of a second too late. "We are as we were made." Langley sucked in a sharp breath. "What the hell does that mean?" None of them answered. They just stood there waiting, their empty ribcages expanding and contracting, with no real breath, no reason. Their bodies shouldn't have functioned, and yet they remained upright, intact. The walls around them began to shift, not physically, not in a way that could be measured, but in a way that made my eyes struggle to keep the dimensions fixed. The angles of the room bent just slightly, stretching beyond what should have been spatially possible. The corners extended, the ceiling pulled away from the floor, and I realized with creeping horror that I could no longer tell where the room ended and where the crew began. Langley's breathing stuttered. I turned and saw his face twisted in shock, staring past me. I followed his eyes to the security monitor. The rest of the station was changing too. It wasn't just happening inside the chamber, it was spreading. The station wasn't altering itself. Reality was trying to accommodate something it didn't understand. The glass beside us flickered. For a moment, there was nothing behind it, just empty, depthless space. Then the chamber returned like a frame buffering back into focus. The crew didn't move. Their forms were stabilizing, finalizing. And I understood something else, something worse than everything that had come before. This wasn't an accident. It was a process. Something had prepared them. And now whatever was inside them, whatever they had become, was preparing us. The glass flickered again, then disappeared. Not a malfunction, not an illusion. The quarantine chamber was coming apart, its existence unraveling at the edges, as if something were deciding, in real time, whether to keep it here or let it slip into whatever void waited beyond. Langley had the emergency lockout panel open, trying to eject the Valiant before... Before what? Before the station collapsed into itself? Before reality folded under the weight of something that shouldn't be here? Monroe turned toward us. No movement, no steps taken. He was just closer now, though I hadn't seen him move. We are as we were made. His voice came from nowhere, from inside us, and I felt something press against the back of my skull. An idea that wasn't mine, a structure forcing itself into my perception, trying to make space for itself inside my mind. Langley gasped beside me, his hands going limp against the panel. His breath turned shallow. I saw his fingers twitch, bending and recoiling as if testing a shape they hadn't known before. I grabbed and shook him. "Langley, don't listen, stay here." He looked at me, and I saw his pupils dilate, stretching wider, his mouth parting in a slow, soundless exhale. It was already inside him. It was already inside me. My vision blurred. The walls didn't look like walls anymore, just outlines of something that had once been a station, now soft, malleable, undoing itself. Langley's breathing hitched. I felt his weight sag, and when I turned fully to him, his eyes were too far apart. His jaw hung just a little too loose. His ribs were stretching outward. My legs locked beneath me. My fingers wouldn't obey my own commands. A deep pressure coiled inside my chest, something warm, something reshaping, something correcting the parts of me that didn't belong to it yet. Langley's voice whispered from just beside my ear. "You were always meant to be." I tried to scream, but there was nothing inside my throat anymore. Just depth, just space waiting to be filled. And then, the last pieces of myself, of who I had been, peeled away.